this webinar. Hopefully for some of you, this is the last of your webinars as you get ready to wind down the year. We have survived 2020. And if it is not, since we are not traveling, maybe you're going to spend the rest of your holidays in webinars. We're excited to be having this webinar about the vaccine. Lots has been said and has been discussed over the months, especially in the last few weeks about the vaccine. We've long awaited it and awaited great progress in it. And so we're excited that there are a few vaccines that are being considered and tried out in different places, or at least we're anticipating a few of them. Lots has happened and in the scientific fraternity regarding understanding what the treatment modalities of COVID-19 are, even understanding how to accurately test for it, test for its presence, test for our body's response to it, reduce the costs of treatment and testing. And now with the vaccine, after so many trials have happened, we have lots to look forward to. There are, of course, at the same time, many myths about the vaccine, where it is, how long it's going to be here, how long it's going to take for it to land in our shores. Many myths about how much it's going to cost, whether it will break the balance, whether South Africans can afford it, how many vaccines there are globally. There are myths about whether or not vaccines have been put out outside of the ones that we have heard about recently. And so hopefully today we'll shed some light on several elements relating to the vaccine. We're excited to have quite a few of our clients present. We're excited to have healthcare providers present, a few of them. We're equally excited to have some of the academic fraternity around. We're looking forward to hearing some of your questions and being able to answer as many of them as possible. Our esteemed panel, we're very grateful for you to have given us some of your time and share your insights and your expertise and helping the society to understand it better. The more of us know, the more accurate information can be spread out into the South African populace. We have 4 panelists who are going to be sharing with us different natures of conversation regarding the vaccine. We've got Prof Greg Hussey from UCT, the Institute of Molecular Science, and he's going out about the vaccine. Then we've got Dr. Anban Pillay, who is a DDG in the National Department of Health, who's going to speak about South Africa's preparedness. Then we've got Mr. Tian Johnson, who is part of the Vaccine Advocacy Coalition, which is interested in the global access to vaccine, and he's from a community perspective, and he's going to be sharing some insights from that perspective. And then lastly, we've got Dr. Samu Dube, who's the head of the Health Policy Unit in MedScheme, which is a subsidiary of AfroCentric. And so it will be nice to hear the various voices relating to the vaccines that I think are critical for us to be thinking about and speaking about. So without much further ado, I will start with Prof Hussey, and he will really focus how it works and how immunity would look like, etc. So various elements about the science of the vaccine. He is a leading voice in relation to vaccinology and has been working with various professors globally and has been working with our very own minister and some of the advisory panels regarding the vaccine. So he will start us going, and then I'll ask him a few questions and then we'll proceed. If you remember, please to keep your microphones on silent. And if you have questions or comments, please be active in the chat. I'll be watching it very closely so that I can ask some of the questions that don't come through. We will we'll answer your questions as we go, or we'll answer them at the end, depending on how the conversation is going. Prof, are you ready?
Yes, thanks. I'll share my screen with you.
Fabulous.
And I can't start my video either. because it says the host has stopped it.
All right, maybe one of the hosts can unstop it for you. Host.
Just give me a minute.
Are you able to share your screen though, despite the fact that the host has disabled your video?
Okay, I've started my video. I'll share my screen.
Fabulous.
Screen sharing is not happening. Try again.
Wonderful.
Can you see the screen?
We can see
We
it.
are seeing the screen. It is about to come onto slideshow, I'm sure. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Take it away.
Thanks, Lungi. Thanks for the invitation from Afrocentric to participate in this little webinar. So I thought I'd set the scene for the other speakers. And please, if I'm stepping into the terrain that you're going to talk about, please just stop me. That's to the other speakers. So I thought I'll start off by talking a little bit about the COVID vaccine developments generally, and some of the implications for South Africa. So currently there are over 273 vaccine candidates. And for those of you who are interested, this comes from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London. They have a vaccine tracker, and you can go and play around with this tracker. It will tell you everything about the different vaccines. So there are about 273 vaccine candidates, and there are 58 in clinical testing. That means, for those of you who don't know much about it, is that it's gone into humans and it's gone through what is called stage 1 and stage 2, which essentially is safety and immunogenicity. And then some of them have gone to stage 3, which is essentially testing for efficacy. And these trials usually include anything between 30 and 50,000. So there are essentially 12 vaccines that are in phase 3 trials. And this is a lot on the slide, but I'll walk you through it. So does my mouse show up at all when I wave my pointer?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yes,
Okay,
it
thanks.
does.
All right. So the first 4 are what are called inactivated vaccines. All right. So there are 4 inactivated vaccines. And for example, a common inactivated vaccine that we would use generally would be something like influenza, all right? Or a diphtheria vaccine, you know, and the whole list of inactivated vaccines that are currently in use for immunization. Then there are 4 what are called non-replicating viral vectored vaccines. And these use what are called adenovirus vectors. So the adenovirus is used as the vehicle to enter the body and stimulate the immune system with the antigen, right? And again, the non-replicating viral vectors have been used before. So for example, it's been used for, we in fact had a HIV vaccine trial a few years ago called the STEP trial that used a non-replicating viral vector here in South Africa. It's used, one of the non-replicating viral vectors is used for Ebola virus as well. And then there are 2 protein subunit vaccines, and then there are the 2 new on the block messenger RNA vaccines. So if you see this little stars on the left, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the Janssen or J&J vaccine, the Novavax vaccine, and the Pfizer vaccine, these 4 have included trial sites in South Africa, all right? So South Africa have contributed to the global vaccine testing for those 4. Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine trial results have been published, and it was published about a week ago in The Lancet. And the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. If you look in this column here, the doses, most of them use 2 doses. In fact, all of them except for the CanSino Chinese vaccine, which uses a single dose. And then the J&J vaccine that's been tested in South Africa also uses a single dose. But they also have another trial with a 2-dose vaccine. And the timing is just listed. They're either 14 days, first dose given on day 0, second dose 28. The other Janssen vaccine, either single dose or 2-dose schedule at 0 and 56 days, right? And then there's one vaccine from China, which is a protein subunit that delivers 3 doses and at 0, 28, and 56. So as I said, Oxford AstraZeneca have published their results and overall efficacy of 70%. The Gamaleya Research Institute, their vaccine from Russia, it's called Sputnik, lovely name, 91% effective. And then, as you know, the Pfizer, 95%, and Moderna, 94%. This one here, the Sinopharm inactivated vaccine, there was a report in the news recently of a trial from the United Arab Emirates claiming 85% efficacy. So that's where we are with the vaccines in phase 3. The results from the others are expected later this year, well, almost the end of the year, probably early next year. So that's encouraging. 12 in phase 3, a number coming through into phase 3 from phase 2 quite soon. What we do not know about these vaccines are firstly, the fact that we're not sure how long the immunity after vaccination will last. We don't know why the vaccines are not 100% effective. So if you're taking the, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, 70% effective, 30% fail. Why the 30% fail, we don't know. And we will soon gather enough information to try to identify vaccine failures. And that's important in future vaccine development. All the vaccines have reduced the incidence of COVID-19 disease in the recipients, as well as reduced disease severity, but we don't know whether the vaccines will prevent transmission to impact on community. There is some suggestion from the AstraZeneca vaccine that the vaccine may in fact prevent transmission. The fourth point is we don't know what the potential long-term adverse effects of these vaccines are. The current evidence suggests that they are safe and effective with no significant adverse events. And like most vaccines, there's an ongoing surveillance for adverse events following licensure in most countries, including South Africa. And then the big conundrum, we don't know whether people will accept the vaccines. And I'm sure Tian will talk about this. This was a Gallup poll done about a month ago, globally in about 27 countries, over 20,000 people, and 74% of people said they'll get a COVID vaccine, ranging from 54 to 97%. South Africa participants, only 64% said they will get the vaccine. And obviously in South Africa, 36% of people refuse or said they would refuse a vaccine. And the reasons for refusal include they're worried about side effects, they're against vaccines in general, they don't think it will be effective, and they don't think they're at risk from COVID. And I'm sure Tian will elaborate on that. So Anban, please stop me if I venture into your territory, but I just want to say a few brief words about the framework that all of us are working on, who are involved with the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Vaccines. We are developing a South African framework, and the framework essentially has 3 legs. The first one is the scientific leg, Second one is an ethical leg. And the third one is an implementation leg. The science is all around evidence-informed decision-making, right? Availability of vaccine, the need for vaccine. I'm not going to talk much about ethics, but ethics underpins much of what we do. And maybe Tian will talk to this as well. It's around equity, justice, transparency, minimizing harm and maximizing benefit. And then it's about implementation. And I'm sure Anban will allude to issues around surveillance, training, monitoring, and evaluation. So who should get the vaccine? Ideally, everybody in South Africa should get the vaccine. But given the scarcity, we would probably need to prioritize as to who is first in line. And we have to balance the issue of individual health benefit, i.e. reducing disease and mortality, that's morbidity and mortality, versus public health benefits, i.e. herd immunity. I think the big issue is the availability and the cost of vaccines, and Anban can allude to some of those issues. And then government on its own cannot fund vaccines for all in South Africa, and we would have to include the private partner in some way. Sorry, the private sector in some way, so develop public-private partnerships. So when we think about priority groups for vaccination, this is not rocket science. There are variations on the theme globally, but essentially many countries are targeting healthcare workers as they are the people in the front line caring for patients. So this includes the health professionals, general health workers, and let's not forget the general health workers, the person working in the kitchen, the porter, the person working in the storeroom, etc., etc. Also includes care home workers and traditional healers. Then persons with comorbidities and those at risk for morbidity and mortality, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But that includes the elderly, persons living with HIV, TB, diabetes, etc. People in overcrowded settings, persons in prisons, detention centers, informal settlement shelters, care homes, people working in the hospitality and tourism industry and educational institution. And then another category of essential workers, excluding healthcare workers, and this would include police officers, miners, security workers, retail food workers, essential municipal services, etc., etc. Last point to note is that the safety and efficacy of vaccines in children and pregnant women are not as yet known and will probably be the subject of future trials, and thus decisions on vaccinating these groups will have to wait. Just in terms of healthcare workers, this is an old report dating back to middle of August, with 240 healthcare workers dying from COVID-19. I think our president last night indicated that close on to 400 healthcare workers have passed away as a consequence of COVID. Over 5,000 healthcare workers have been admitted to hospital, and over 40,000 healthcare workers were infected, right? So it's not just the disease impact, it's also the psychological trauma that these workers go through. Okay, so post-traumatic stress syndrome is extremely common, and this is just one reference from China, showing that 40% of healthcare workers interviewed had significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders. I'm sure you know all of this. We know that mortality is highest in males compared to females. You see at the bottom, these are patients admitted to hospital. Close on to 20% mortality for males versus 15% for females. And as you can see, the mortality increases from young age to older age, so that by the age of 80, 40% plus of people admitted to hospital will not make it out of hospital, compared to maybe only 4% of those in the age group 20 to 29. This slide you can't read, and I don't expect you to read it, but this is the only published data that we have from the country. This is by Andrew Bull, who's an epidemiologist in the Western Cape province, For those of you interested, this was published in one of the journals, international journals recently. But the point to make here is, again, males at a higher risk than females from dying, older people at a higher risk than younger people. People with diabetes have a higher risk than normal people, i.e. normal non-diabetics. The more severe your diabetes, the higher your risk of dying, all right? So in this case, those with an HbA1c greater than 9%, 12-fold greater risk than the reference population with no diabetes. Hypertensives have a higher risk, people with chronic disease, people with current tuberculosis, and then people with HIV, especially those who have a CD4 count of less than 200 cells per microliter. So just very briefly, there are 6 key considerations in the selection of a COVID vaccine for South Africa. And this talks to the issue, we want to have a safe vaccine that doesn't have any adverse effects. We want to have a vaccine that will give us long-lasting immunogenicity and a vaccine that's effective. So we currently have about 4 vaccines that have an efficacy in excess of 70%. We want a vaccine that's easy to use and a schedule that's not complicated. So ideally a single dose vaccine. 1 dose would be promising. The vaccines that have published or have indicated results are all 2 doses. We want vaccines that are easily to store and distribute. So our cold chain for our national vaccine program use conventional vaccine fridges that store vaccines between the temperature of 2 and 8. Moderna requires a storage of -20, and Pfizer requires a storage of -80. And certainly those are not practical, even in the private sector. And then obviously we need a supply and a sustainable supply of vaccine. We need a vaccine at low cost to the country. And you have seen that the Pfizer vaccine is going at around about $20 a dose, Moderna around about $30 a dose, and AstraZeneca only at $3 a dose. And then finally, the 6th point is that we have to get SAPRA approval. All right. And then just lastly, in terms of herd immunity, the estimated herd immunity for COVID is around about 60 to 70%. So if we want to get everybody protected, we need to have about 60 to 70% of the people at risk successfully vaccinated. That figure depends on the vaccine efficacy. So if we use, and this we have to put into our calculations, if we use, for example, the current AstraZeneca vaccine with a vaccine of 70% efficacy, we'll have to increase our coverage to 95%. If we use a Pfizer Moderna vaccine at 95%, we could probably get away with a vaccine coverage of 70%. So Lungi, I think I'll pause there. And if there are any points of clarification, I'm happy to do that, but we could probably go on with the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Very enlightening. And you actually answered quite a sure, thank you. You actually answered quite a few questions that have come to us from various quarters. But perhaps I ask you 1 or 2 questions before we move to Anban. The first question is, do you foresee that we would have to use this vaccine every year, like the flu vaccine? So the flu vaccine, you have to get vaccinated every year. Is our thinking, or at least what we understand so far, that one would have to vaccinate every year?
Well, the reason why we vaccinate every year with flu is that the flu virus changes quite dramatically, right, in terms of its genetic makeup. And we have different subtypes, significant subtypes in terms of A, B, etc. All right. So we have to every year make a new vaccine for influenza. So far, even though the COVID COVID-19 virus, the SARS virus, does change in terms of its genetic makeup, the changes are not significant, right? I mean, people have said to date, there are probably over 100, maybe close to 500 different mutations of the virus. And you may have seen in the recent news from the UK that there's a new strain circulating, right? The likelihood is that the strain is not going to make any difference in terms of disease severity, and it probably won't make any difference in terms of the need for the vaccine. So the big question is how long immunity will last. So if immunity only lasts for a year or two, then we would have to provide booster vaccination.
100%. So maybe related to that question, I suppose, although I think you've answered it by implication, is whether we have to vaccinate those who have already had COVID.
Yes,
so when we're calculating the numbers needed, I imagine that needed to vaccinate, we'd exclude those that have had COVID, we'd exclude pregnant women potentially, we'd exclude children potentially. And so the pool of people that actually need to get the vaccine, if we look at your priority groups, theoretically would be much smaller. Is that true?
Yeah, so if you look at some data that's come out of, for example, the Western Cape here in Cape Town, as well as some data that's emerged from Kenya, it looks like, certainly in Mombasa and Cape Town, that about 40% of people are so-called immune. They have antibodies.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So that would suggest that they are protected. We don't know that for a fact, okay?
Yeah.
So let's assume that they are protected. We can then say we don't have to vaccinate them. We can only vaccinate 60% of the people. All right. So we don't have to vaccinate everybody. From a public health perspective, you know, there is virtually no public health program that tests for immunity before vaccination. There's one exception, and that's dengue virus infection, which is a very rare disease, which we won't talk about now. It doesn't occur in Southern Africa, where you have to test before you give the vaccine because there's a complication. But it's something that is currently under discussion. Do we test to see whether there are antibodies? And if they've got antibodies, we don't vaccinate, right? So the jury isn't out on that as yet. But the easiest way is to, you know, anything that moves out there that is at risk for COVID, vaccinate.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Obviously, taking into consideration all the other elements that you've said about cost and prioritization. Yeah. Wonderful. Do not disappear. We will be back to you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I'll put my video off.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. We are then now going to move to Dr. Anban Pillay from the National Department of Health, and he's going to speak us through South Africa's preparedness. To a certain degree, he'll answer some of the questions that are left unanswered so far from Greg, and take us one step further. I'll also ask you a few extra questions, Anban, after this before we open to everybody else's question. I can see your slides. You can go.
Sorry, this is not the, sorry. Just trying to.
They were up actually, or you couldn't see them on your side.
Yeah, I couldn't see them. Sorry.
I see. Nomlinda, your question is noted. It's the $1,000 question, but I will ask it later, just to keep us all guessing.
Is it visible now?
Yes, it is visible. It is visible.
Okay. Let me just put it in slideshow and then we can.
Yes, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to cover a couple of areas, but Greg has helped me out with some of the slides, so I'll probably shift through them quite quickly since probably you covered those areas. So I think important to mention that we have a ministerial advisory committee on COVID, and this committee is intended to, amongst others, review the evidence relating to vaccines, as well as best practice to advise us on appropriate vaccine options based on the evidence-based reviews, also the vaccine purchasing options that we may have, the budget implications, the priority groups for vaccination, the vaccine rollout strategy, as well as the development and manufacture of a COVID-19 vaccine. The members of the group, you can see Professor Hussey is there, a very active member of the group. There are other members as well, such as the CEO of BioVac, representative from the Department of Science and Technology, Ms. Luertz, the CEO of SAPRA, Dr. Samete, Professor Mpashlele from the MRC, Professor Helen Rees, who's the chair of SAPRA and a number of other committees, Professor Ims Dai, Dr. Blecher from Treasury, Professor Karim, and also Bishop Mpurwana. They're both representatives from the other MACs. So I'm not going to go through too much of this in detail. I just wanted to make the point that the key steps in developing a vaccine are clearly from basic research to testing for safety and efficacy, and finally getting to clinical trials. And this is the stepwise process that vaccines have to go through as well. I think the important point here that I wanted to make on the trial side of things is that ordinarily, in order to get from the preclinical testing through to the phase 4 is probably 12 to 20 years in total. And here we've been able to put out a vaccine in about a year or less, actually. And so clearly this was phenomenal work on the side of the developers of a vaccine who've been able to get out a vaccine in this record time. There are obviously some implications for this, one of which is this is not long, the data is not long term, and so a consequence of which is that we would want to understand a lot more about the safety and efficacy in the longer term around immunity, etc. We don't have that information, but certainly the trials are continuing to collect that data, so it's it will continue to come through as it becomes available. I think Professor Hussey, went through this about the various types of vaccines. I just wanted to make this point around the RNA vaccines, and the reason I make the point is largely because of I think some of the issues that relate to this. You may have noted in the media some concerns around vaccines causing harm or representing the devil, as some would say. Just to explain what this RNA vaccine is, I assume this is the vaccine some people were talking about. So this vaccine basically is where a viral genetic code is built in and introduced into a cell. And the consequence of that is to prompt the immune system to produce antibodies to activate T cells so that when they're exposed to the virus, they're able to respond effectively. Now, using genetic material to stimulate the immune system or to create an intervention is not an entirely new concept in medical science. It's been used in a number of areas before. So this won't be the first time that we're using this in the management of disease. I would agree it's the first time we're using it in vaccines, but certainly there have been a number of other instances where genetic manipulation has happened. And so the point I suppose I want to make is that we shouldn't be kind of too overly alarmed by the fact that this is going on, because it's been around for a long time. On the Oxford vaccine side, I think Professor Hussey explained this already, so I'm not going to spend time talking about how the Oxford vaccine will work or the AstraZeneca vaccine. Let me talk more about the COVAX facility, because we're spending a lot of time working with them to try to access vaccines. So what happened is that when there were vaccines were starting to be developed, it was very clear that this was largely happening in the developed countries. And historical experience tells us that when these developments happen in the developed nations, they usually are the only ones that have access to the intervention, whether it's a drug or anything similar. And the developing or least developed countries have very little access to this. So to try and alleviate this problem, the WHO, UNICEF, Gates Foundation, the World Bank, together with Gavi, which is the Global Alliance on Vaccines, said, let us collectively put funds and contribute towards the development and manufacture of vaccines. And they call this COVAX. So that's how the name COVAX came about. And the intention is to collectively manage the development, production, and supply of vaccines through a single funding arrangement. And this single fund will then buy vaccines on behalf of countries and facilitate the supply in a manner that's equitable, so that there is no maldistribution as such. So to depict this differently, we have the COVAX facility in the middle, and you have our countries on the left. Countries would ordinarily just go to manufacturers and ask them if they could buy their vaccine. The problem with that is that depending on how wealthy you are, you will be on a priority list, and you would not be able to pay the price usually that the manufacturers are asking. And only after a while, probably a few years, the price of the vaccine would come down, and then manufacturers would be willing to talk to you. And that was what has happened in many cases with other products. So COVAX is intended to shorten that period, and they do that by collectively accumulating the funds from all countries, engaging with manufacturers, and then creating basically a supply for vaccines using that mechanism. So what progress have we made to date? Well, the original deadline for the submission of a signed agreement was the 18th of September. We had a number of concerns around the agreement, so we could not sign it immediately. And we were then required to make payment by the 9th of October. We didn't do that either because we didn't sign the agreement, given some of the clauses, and I'll talk a little bit about the clauses now. By the 24th of November, about 189 countries signed up. And 97 were self-financing countries, and the other 92 were low and middle income countries. The majority of those were beneficiaries of COVAX, in that COVAX will provide to the lowest income countries vaccine doses through some sort of donation or financing agreement. South Africa obviously wouldn't qualify for that, and we would have to pay for our vaccines. So here's some of the concerns we had with the COVAX agreement, so that I just put this in perspective. The first was around the effectiveness. One of the clauses in the agreement stated that the minimum threshold for a vaccine will be 50%, meaning that if any vaccine reached a 50% threshold, we will then be offered that vaccine. And our concern with that was, we clearly would not want a vaccine necessarily with 50%. We'd obviously want a vaccine that's much better. Fortunately, all of the vaccines that have come through to date are way above that, and they're all in 79, 95%. And so we're happy with that, but it was a problem at that time. We didn't have sight of what the data was going to look like. Secondly, on the unit price. So if the problem we have is that our procurement law makes it quite clear that where government is procuring something, it has to do so through a competitive process. The COVAX agreement basically takes away any government procurement and hands that to a global authority in the form of COVAX. In COVAX doing so, we would have to expect that COVAX would provide us or negotiate a very good price for the vaccine. The problem is that if COVAX doesn't provide us with a good price, we may then incur a higher price than we could have procured it on our own. And so that's a concern we had, and we wanted to propose to COVAX, so we were arguing that there should be some clause that allows us to opt out if we believe that they negotiate to higher price. The third thing is around the price transparency in terms of the investments. So very clearly within the COVAX agreement, there is a proportion of the payment which goes towards R&D, but the detail of how much of our contribution goes towards R&D was not provided. That only gets provided to you after you make the payment, which is a bit late in my view, because we'd like to know upfront as to how much is going into R&D. And that fund that goes into R&D may be lost. So if you invest in R&D and the R&D of that product does not materialize, then your deposit, your upfront payment is lost. And so that's something I think which is a problematic for us. Number 4 is also a problem in that there was a clause that required us to make sure that the product is registered. We made it quite clear that we cannot make sure our product's registered. Our regulator is independent, and the product would have to pass the regulatory process independently of us. So we can only procure the vaccine after it passes that process. Then there was an issue around liability as well. There is a clause that says that because the vaccine was developed in such a short space of time, the 12 months, as opposed to 12 years or to 20 years, that there may be adverse events or efficacy issues, etc. And the manufacturer is not willing to accept liability that may arise given that this was done in public interest, etc. So that clause remains within the COVAX agreement that we have. And my understanding is that this clause is in all contracts with all countries. The fifth issue we had was around supplier performance. And here our big problem was that if a supplier doesn't deliver, it wasn't clear as to what were the opt-out clauses, and we were arguing against that. And then finally, there was an issue around the whole issue of concern if we'd be forced to accept a vaccine that wouldn't be appropriate for the South African setting. So as an example, if we were given the Pfizer vaccine, which must be kept at -70, -80 degrees, and we don't have the capacity to do so, how would we then manage this? And so we wanted the ability to be able to choose that at least. So this obviously caused delays, and there was a reluctance on the side of Treasury to take risk around R&D, where we would effectively be taking risk and may lose funds if that particular vaccine doesn't come to bear. Nevertheless, in the meantime, Solidarity Fund had learned about this, and they came to the assistance of Treasury to say, we're prepared to make a risk-related donation. And so they've come through to pay the deposit, which is 327 million, which is kind of in some ways a risk-linked deposit. So we've had to enter into a financial agreement with the Solidarity Fund for that amount. So just to give you a sense, we went with the COVAX option initially, largely because COVAX required us to make a down payment and then the balance later. If we did a bilateral agreement, that would require upfront payment being made, and it would be only to one vaccine manufacturer, because they were also demanding at that point in time that there is some upfront payment. COVAX had 9 vaccines in their portfolio. The bilateral agreements, you'd only get into an agreement with about one vaccine, and so you may lose on that score. Then COVAX provided us with a weighted average cost per dose of $10.55, but did say that it could go up to $20.10 per dose. So that is the range that we could end up paying, or that was what was being quoted by COVAX. The bilateral deals, we had no sight of what the prices were going to look like at the point at which we were entering the COVAX agreement. The COVAX facility initially said that we can go up to 50% of the population. They have subsequently adjusted that down to 20%. And I understand that would be the maximum at this stage. There was no volume guarantee on the bilateral side as well. The final vaccine price on the side of COVAX will be selected by COVAX as such with the manufacturer. And on the other side, obviously, the final price is determined by the manufacturer. So there are a number of risks, as you can see, between the bilaterals as well as the COVAX. And in that context, we decided to go with COVAX. It's not a perfect agreement by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's the best we have. So where is COVAX currently? Well, they have various products at various stages. The Pfizer-BioNTech product, as well as the Moderna product, is going to be available probably in 2021, in the first part of 2021. The others that are coming through which use alternative technology as opposed to the mRNA, the AstraZeneca product, the Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, the Sinopharm, the Sinovac, as well as the CanSin Bio and the Sputnik product as well. There are additional products coming through in late 2021, 2022. At this stage, we don't have full sight of their capability in terms of performance, but we'll probably learn more about that with time. So timelines, I think somebody asked in the Q&A about timelines. So this is the lead-in that COVAX has given us at this stage. AstraZeneca will be ready with their dossier in Q1 2021. And thereafter, the dotted lines suggest the regulatory period. The solid line is the actual supply. So depending when it gets into the regulator, we're looking at about mid-2021 there, Q1. And then in the early parts of Q2 2021, it will then get the AstraZeneca product. As you heard, the AstraZeneca colleagues have also done a tech transfer to Serum Institute of India, and Serum is going to probably have their dossier ready a bit later than the Astra dossier, and that's probably going to be ready in Q2 2021, probably in a couple of weeks after the approval of the AstraZeneca product. Then we have the Sanofi product much later on, and then a few others which clearly COVAX can't reveal the names of at this stage. So that's where we are with that. What is the plan in terms of production? The idea is that in the Q1 and Q2, we will be getting doses, but the doses will be fairly low. And you can see that the idea is to build up to 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. And much of that ramp up will happen in Q3 and Q4. Q1 and Q2, Q1 part of it will be taken up by regulatory issues, and they would need to get the productions facilities in tune to be able to massify the production. And we anticipate that in Q3 and 4 they will have much significant supply. In terms of our readiness and planning for the vaccine rollout, the WHO has prepared a number of checklists of what countries should have in place in order for them to deliver the vaccine. And they relate to these key areas. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but clearly there needs to be planning and coordination. Regulatory issues must be dealt with, surveillance, service delivery arm, the vaccine cold chain and logistics, safety surveillance, demand generation and communication as part of an effective vaccine program. The department has an EPI program, and the colleagues there have been managing this vaccine rollout program for a number of other vaccines. So they're quite familiar with this, and they've prepared a plan which I think will be ready fairly soon. And that is what we would use to roll out the vaccine as soon as it gets to our shores in early Q2, as I indicated. So in terms of rollout, we're awaiting details of exactly how much will be allocated to South Africa from COVAX. We will certainly be part of the first allocation, which comes in Q2 2021. The actual quantity we don't know. We were told it'll be about 3% of the population, but that's yet to be confirmed. clearly the vaccine must, the application must come to SAPRA. You would have heard that in the media that SAPRA is very much gearing itself to respond to this, and I think that shouldn't be a huge problem. At this stage, we don't know in Q2 exactly when, but hopefully that would be in the early parts of Q2. The price on the vaccine, as I said, COVAX is quoted as $10.55, but as much as $20.10. Serum, on the other hand, which is been funded quite significantly by the Gates Foundation, is targeting $3 to $5 a dose. We hope that that comes through so that we'd be able to access that. Now, in the private sector, I know this may be of interest to yourselves. We're looking at making the vaccine part of the PMB so that it can be accessed by members of a medical scheme. The priority groups, I think Professor Hussey has alluded to what these priority groups are. We will soon be publishing that, which the MAC has developed. The idea would be that these would be the groups that would access this in the order of priority, depending on what quantity of vaccine becomes available initially. We have been talking to the companies about a single purchasing framework, meaning that the public sector or government will procure the total volume of vaccine required by the country. We will then release the proportion of the stock required for the private sector based on the quantity of the priority groups that are residing in the private sector. So one of the things in the readiness plan that we need to talk about is having some kind of a process of identifying early on who would be the eligible people in each group, so that once we get vaccine, we're able to easily identify them. I think the private sector would probably be able to do a better job than the public sector, largely because you have your medical scheme members, you know who they are, where they are, etc. In the public sector, we would battle, I think, to try and find everybody that would need a dose of the vaccine. I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much, Lungi.
Thank you very much, Anban. You have created many questions in the chat, which are great. Huh? You always do. Are you that? Do you create that much that much attention? So we'll answer some of them shortly. Perhaps let me start with asking some simpler ones. Just the first question is the slides that you showed us that show the doses that are going to be ready up to 2 billion by 2022. Are those the total doses that will be available to all of COVAX or just the South African portion? So my assumption is that those numbers will be all of the doses available to COVAX, and then they'll still be divvied up.
That's right. Yeah. So there's 2 billion is the COVAX target in terms of what they need for all the countries. They will then go through an allocation across countries, making sure that everyone gets an appropriate proportion. Remember, they're talking about 3% of your population. So 3% in South Africa is a bit different from 3% in India. So that's
that is very correct. All right. The second question is, in Prof Hussey's, and actually even in your slide deck, you spoke about the various considerations about the vaccine that one wants to consider: the costs, the immunogenicity, the efficacy, whether the supply chain that might be required for it. And it looked like in your slides, AstraZeneca's vaccine may be the one first off the blocks. Are we happy, or are you happy with the elements of all of those considerations relating to AstraZeneca? So its cold chain supply, its efficacy, are we happy with all of those? So if it was the first to hit us, would we be comfortable that we could roll it out in South Africa easily, from what you could see?
Look, the Ministerial Advisory Committee has to make a call. So I think that committee must formally evaluate the data. We don't have all the data, but from the data I've seen, I'm pretty happy with its performance at this stage. Given the timing, I think it's also an issue of timing here, because if we're holding out for other vaccines that may be better, etc., we're probably losing a lot of time in terms of the immunization program. And so I think for me, time is of the essence. So we'd rather go with this for now. We can always back this up with better vaccines as they become available over time.
All right. Two more questions, perhaps the first one on the issue of time. One of the questions by Jackie is that other countries have shortened the process, the regulatory process. Is there an intention in South Africa to shorten the regulatory process to make it to make time for the vaccine to hit people much shorter?
Yeah, so I think all of the regulators in the UK as well as the US have applied what they call emergency use approval, and SAHPRA is planning to do the same thing. So the idea is that if the product has been approved in those markets, they would get most of the data from them, and I think do a much shorter review, for the purposes of emergency use.
All right. Then the last question for now is the question that I mentioned everyone's asking is, you mentioned that the intention is for the National Department of Health to have a single purchasing framework, so to purchase the total vaccine. But would there be appetite for either individuals who are able to find the vaccine in other countries, or if the private sector is able to have bilateral agreements with some of the pharma companies, would that be acceptable for them to be able to get the vaccine easier, quicker, or whatever the case may be?
Well, I think if we're going to get the vaccine quicker, then we would obviously want to talk about that. But the idea would be to make sure that there is, while we're achieving global equity with COVAX, we also want to achieve equity internally in South Africa and make sure that simply because somebody was able to access it much easier, that they don't necessarily skip the queue, if I can put it like that, and make sure the priority groups, as the MAC has identified, are managed appropriately. My understanding is that the pharma companies are not keen to sell into the private market because of the liability clause. So they're largely interested in selling to governments, and they would want to then get into one national agreement around it, because they're not really going to be marketing these products, etc.
Yeah, no, I mean, and also I suppose theoretically, one could, by having a single purchaser, one can avoid the scenario where the vaccine is so much cheaper via EPI, as it is with, say, varicella vaccine is cheaper if you have it through the government, and it's like 6 times more if you have it in the private sector. So to avoid those kinds of elements is what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. We also would want to make sure that everybody who's vaccinated gets some kind of identification, because that would be important going forward for various reasons.
Yeah. Also, I suppose so that you can know whether we've actually reached the coverage levels, right?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. We'll pause there for now and move swiftly to Tian, who's going to start speaking about some of these elements about access and equity, and some of the global community views regarding access to the vaccine. Tian, if you remember, he's part of the Vaccine Advocacy Coalition, which is a global group made up of community players, and they raise different kinds of matters regarding to access to vaccines. And you've probably thought a lot about the science of implementation, Tian, and I'm sure you'll touch on some of those elements as you go. Over to you, Tian.
Thanks so much, Lumi, and thank you everyone for the invite. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I think just some overview comments. Since COVID-19 arrived, I think civil society has really been compelled to pivot and work in this new space of COVID-19. So since around June, we've been holding weekly public webinars that really engage the public and civil society with some of the key researchers and scientists, not only in South Africa, but in the region as well. But as we lead up to potential rollout in the next few months, we've been increasingly thinking about messaging and engaging communities around messaging, especially when it comes to prioritization. So I think I'm actually just going to share a few slides that I shared at this morning's session at the AU and ACDC. I'm not sure if you can see my screen.
I can see your screen. We can.
Great, great. So part of the discussions we were having is this context of the anti-vaxxer movement, vaccine hesitancy, and vaccine denialism, and how all of this has the potential to undermine a national rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. Because I think, as we've known from decades of experience, that we can invest millions in in the cold chain system, we can have all of our science right, all of our infrastructure right, but if communities aren't excited about accessing a vaccine, if communities don't know why they should be accessing a vaccine, if communities are fearful, uncertain, afraid, buying into or listening to the hesitancy messages, I think it jeopardizes all of the efforts that we've put into this work so far, including the many millions of rands. So some of the questions we begin to ask is that we do this work around communication within a historical context, right? And we've learned from HIV, we've learned from seatbelt and road safety campaigns, we've learned from secondhand smoking campaigns, that there are ways in which we can creatively reach communities at their point of need in languages they understand, in contexts that make sense to them. So as a baseline, we acknowledge that vaccine rollout happens in a historical context, and that historical context is rooted in a historically justified mistrust of science and research. And we have to address it. It's an uncomfortable topic to address. It's the elephant in the room, and it would be a lot easier if we could just power on forward into all the positives of vaccine programming and all the millions of lives vaccines have saved. But we need to address this because it comes up repeatedly on social media trends and perpetuated by the anti-vaxxer movement and the vaccine hesitancy groups. So once we've acknowledged that, we also acknowledge that significant strides, especially in South Africa, in large part due to the work done by the Department of Health and the SAMRC, we've recognized that there's been significant strides in putting measures and oversight bodies in place to ensure that vaccines are safe. And we need to do more, both as civil society, government, and the private sector, to ensure that messaging is continuously headlined, that vaccines are safe, directly as a way to counter some of that messaging. But the way we build trust and the way we reinforce our integrity with communities is through transparency. And that's something that has really been twofold in my view. On one hand, we've seen this huge opening up of science, an opening up that we hadn't seen or has been very difficult, at least in the HIV space. Science in this country has been traditionally very closed, very white, very exclusive. With the advent of COVID, we've seen some of the country's top scientists really opening themselves up, being willing to share the data, being willing to have these difficult discussions because of the pressure of this pandemic. So that's one. It hasn't been without its issues, though. We had a BCG trial operating out of Cape Town that activists and civil society called on the minister to shut down. This is a trial with all white, all non-South African principal investigators who were refusing to procure personal protective equipment for the healthcare workers that they were enrolling in that trial. They subsequently went on national news and proclaimed that the science is one thing, communities are a side issue. And that obviously is hugely problematic, because what it does is it puts back our collective work to ensure that communities are part and parcel of research and go along with that research journey, and to ensure that communities are involved from protocol design to post-trial access. So we still do not know the trials in South Africa about the access agreements that have been made. And that's something that we will keep the pressure on and are really keen to open up that space. We've had civil society across the world filing access to information applications in their courts to force researchers and scientists to disclose what access agreements they are making in the names of their people. So the vaccine,
Tian,
yes.
may I ask you to speak slightly louder, please?
Sure. So is that better?
Yes, sir.
Great. So the vaccine rollout is happening in that context. It's a context of denialism, hesitancy and an anti-vaxxer movement. And so it's not a given. Usually the response would be, oh, well, let's just give out information. Let's get information out to the people. The evidence doesn't show us that giving out more information counters hesitancy. A large percentage of how we counter vaccine hesitancy rests on the messenger. So we talk about influencers, and that could be influencers at any level. The influencer in your building, the influencer in your street, in your village, in your town, in your city, and so on and so forth. So it's important for us to really look at the integrity of the messenger as well as the integrity and evidence base of the message. A few principles to share quickly, and these are principles that will guide us as we embark on a range of community consultations over the festive period amongst certain groups that are likely to be prioritized for COVID vaccine access. The one is the ease of being involved, right? And we use an example, are we walking up the mountain or are we sliding down the mountain? So how is access made possible at community level? An important issue that communities ask is the one about control. Who is in the driving seat of this issue? I think it's undoubtable that our Department of Health and the Minister of Health became overnight superstars. You know, these are individuals who gained a level of public popularity that we had never seen around science before in this country. And so that was really, really smart in terms of government creating and facilitating a space for really well-respected scientists to actually guide the message and guide the response. In terms of fairness, questions are asked around, if we are all at risk, why do some have access to greater benefits? And these are questions that we as community activists and civil society will have to prepare to answer as we gear up for rollout. In terms of the process of messaging, we have to ask questions like, are you trustworthy? And how do you present? Do you come across as arrogant, concerned, or empathetic? A long-standing problem has been us trying to encourage within the scientific community a sense of humility to really break down those barriers and open up science and research for communities to feel more in touch with it. Issues of morality. Am I wearing this mask for myself or as a result of my love for another? So you could be inspired by the principles of Ubuntu. I am because you are, and so I'm not just wearing this mask to protect myself, but I'm doing it for those I love and those I live with as well. Issues of familiarity around a pandemic are some of the issues that we will have front of mind. Have we encountered this issue before? Can we link communities' memories of childhood vaccines? Can we link certain communities' memories of yellow fever vaccines, for example, for travel, to try and associate those kind of positive links to vaccination, especially with adults, especially amongst adults? And of course, dread. You know, in community work that we do across this country, a constant refrain that we get is, we don't know anyone who has died of this thing. So why are you telling me to wear a mask? Why will I put that vaccine into my body? So it's really important about how we talk about risk in the context of a pandemic with a high recovery rate, as well as with a lot of symptomatic COVID-19 cases. Unlike HIV, where we saw our brothers, our sisters, our relatives were dying in front of our eyes and we knew there was a potential treatment for them, COVID is really different and has really forced us to ask some difficult questions. One of the seminal thinkers around how we communicate around risk, Sandman, spoke about this concept of magnitude over time and space in terms of how death is communicated. And I shared here a screenshot with the chat I had with a community leader from the Eastern Cape. And that really just brought it home for me that we cannot roll out this vaccine in isolation. We cannot roll out this vaccine without talking about social, political, economic issues that communities face. She basically said here, and she's at the coalface and really struggling with trying to get this messaging across to communities who are, to all intents and purposes, living as if there is no COVID. Most people who don't have hope for the future don't care about COVID-19 or passing it on to other people. And I think that's really, really key and drives home the point that how do we begin to tap into communities' imagination for their individual futures, whether that means getting a job, whether that means finishing extending the house, whether that means going to university or to school. How do we tie in this rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine into the aspirations and hopes as a community who don't have a direct line of sight into the death that perhaps we have at a global level? In terms of some of the next steps forward, we were on a session yesterday with Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, at the AU, and she basically ended her session by saying, we need a communications plan. It can't be governments only. Our church leaders, our mosques, our imams, communication is vital, and each country must have a plan and reach out to those trusted in communities to spread the word. We need our young influencers on social media to spread the word. And that really spoke to my heart, because this is work that we're doing in partnership with the MRC and the DSI, is developing this framework of communications in terms of how do we understand our very connected but distinct roles in terms of communicating the arrival of a vaccine in the context of all of this information. One of the things government, I think, should be praised for is the fact that there is a legal framework in which we can prosecute people who willingly and knowingly spread false information around COVID-19. And that's really, really important. So we combine that to deal with the malicious, intentional spreading of misinformation, which directly undermines the investments being made in a vaccine rollout. We combine that with identifying local influences. So influences at community level. Immediately, the response might be, well, why are we not engaging the influencers with 1 million, 2 million followers? And that, the evidence shows, has a lesser impact than engaging communities, influencers at community level. So moving forward, we'll continue this work on this multi-sectoral communication strategy that outlines roles and responsibilities of government, researchers, and civil society. Nearly all of the evidence shows, for example, that government, Department of Health, MRC should not be responding to anti-vaxxer messaging. All that does is it amplifies it and it gives it a larger platform. So I think our way forward is quite clear. As we move forward with these community consultations over the next 6 weeks across the festive season, where we'll be speaking to communities who are over 65, those with comorbidities and healthcare workers and other essential workers, we will use that feedback to feed into a communication strategy to ensure that community consultations have to form the basis of this rollout. And if it doesn't, it directly jeopardizes the investments in time, in money, and in effort that we've all made together. Thank you, Louis. I think you're on
Thank
mute.
you very much, Tian. There we go. Thank you so much, Tian. A few questions for you. On this matter of tempering expectations, what would you say? Because I do think that there's been much talk globally, there's much talk even now, everyone's waiting for this vaccine almost as the thing that's going to solve our COVID problems. And you know, part of the messaging has been to make sure that we keep the messaging on all the preventative elements, right? But what kinds of things would you say we need to be talking about from a tempering expectations kind of process? That's the first question. And then the second one is, what do you see as the role of the private sector in community preparedness?
I think the first one on expectations has been a question that we've dealt with, you know, across all the HIV vaccine trials. How do you manage expectations of communities? But of course, now that we have a range of vaccines, I think it's really important to enter on the premise of honesty and transparency. I think we owe it to communities to be very clear on what is coming and what is not coming. And when it does come, who is going to access that vaccine first? And I think in the work that we're doing right now, we rely heavily on the data. So we've started talking to VITS RHI to ensure that when we go and explain, for example, why those over 60 or 65 perhaps might be a priority group, we need to be backed by the evidence. As advocates, as civil society, we need to go into those communities to make that evidence-based argument. Of course, I would be amiss without saying that all of this is really difficult, because if you have one area in the Eastern Cape where we lost the equivalent of 90,000 Pfizer vaccine doses to corruption in a very short period of time, how do you go to communities and essentially plead poverty and give them a resource argument when that level of looting is taking place within the public health sector? Sure. So I think it's a very difficult balancing act, but I think it can be done because we have done it. And I think it's about helping communities separate the issues. Don't let your anger, your frustration, your mistrust in the public health system impact your ability to keep yourself and your loved ones alive by accessing this vaccine. I think that's the balancing act we have to do. In terms of what private sector could do, I think private sector needs to seriously engage with civil society that has the reach on the ground to support their work. We are one of the only unfunded players in this picture. We're not for profit. We don't make money out of our work, but yet we have the reach, we have the impact, and we have the feet on the ground. And so our call to private sector will be identify and support civil society who is on the ground to ensure that evidence-based messaging is driven to create desire, but while creating desire, manage expectations of what is realistically going to happen in the next few months.
Thank you very much. And I think that, this webinar is part of the reason why we wanted to make sure that we understand the facts as much as possible and to become those people who can spread the messages. We've got principal officers of medical schemes. They've got messaging to their membership base, their beneficiary base. We've got doctors on the call who also can be spreaders of the correct information. And so you say very correctly. Then we've got a few minutes left. Thank you, Tian. We'll come back to you. Samu, you will close us out with some few thoughts. Well, you will be the last talker with a few thoughts on what MedScheme has been up to in this space and how the MedScheme is involved in the story of vaccines in South Africa, specifically in relation to COVID. Just a few words from you before I just do the final round of questions to everybody. Everyone, I have one question for each of you from the Q&A. Samu?
Many thanks, Lungi, for that. And I don't want to keep us long because people want to go for reconciliation day tomorrow. As MedScheme, one of the things that we are looking at and what we've been involved in, obviously, is to make sure that our finger is on the pulse around evidence. So both Professor Greg Hussey and Anban, you outlined some of the clinical trials in the pipeline that we're talking about around the COVID vaccine. So our job is to make sure that whatever is happening, we scrutinize and understand succinctly the safety issues that underlie the vaccine that we're talking about. Because as Tian has just outlined, safety is part of the messaging around access. We look obviously at the immunogenicity and the efficacy thereof of the vaccine, and we've been following closely some of the discussions and the clinical trials, and we note that only in the Lancet and in the NEJM do we have something that is really published that we could actually scrutinize. So our unit specifically looks at evidence. We are tuned into some of the conversations with pharmaceutical companies to understand where they are at, because whilst we're looking at evidence, both in terms of safety, immunogenicity, we also look at effectiveness. So MedScheme, working also with our sister companies, we are aware that some of the vaccines are going to require some specific storage conditions, and within that, and looking at our own value chain, we also liaise with some of our sister companies around how, if at all, this is the vaccine that is going to be the first out of the ban, how are we going to liaise with our sister companies to ensure access. So in the evidence basket, obviously the line of thought is around safety, immunogenicity, efficacy, and effectiveness, where we're looking at implementation science. The second thing, Lungi, that we have been involved in, obviously, is the issue of communication and information dissemination. We've got various stakeholders within our realm, because MedScheme covers 3.8 million lives, and within that, we have got principal officers who are our partners, clients, and stakeholders. We've got reach even of other suppliers and many other stakeholders. How do we package information? And as you have just rightly pointed out here, that we are connected, but how do we remain connected but still distinct in our messaging? So we make sure that we are clear about messages around the COVID vaccine out there, so that members, principal officers, and the general public alike do get a message that is clear and succinct around the vaccine. And the other thing, obviously, when we have looked at evidence, our role and our job is around enabling access. So I've heard Dr. Anban Pillay saying already we're considering that the vaccine becomes a PMB. Yes, acknowledging that, and I did note one of your statements that you made in your presentation where you said that when we're doing the single purchasing framework, some negotiation is possible. In my world, Dr. Pillay, negotiation is always a must, and negotiation is what we actually live by if we are to ensure that the vaccine is accessible and affordable to all. So part of the reason of our existence is to make sure that the reimbursement mechanisms remain affordable so that we could advance within the risk basket that we actually look after. We can advance the access to many of the members. The one key thing where we really want to be plugged into more, Lungi, as my last statement, is around this collaboration. How do we ensure that as private sector, we are involved in some of the government endeavors to make sure that there is access, not only to some of the vaccine, of the COVID medications that we have clearly been involved in, but also the vaccine itself. And I think what we really need to be doing more and more is to collaborate and be plugged into some of the committees. I saw the ministerial advisory committees. We've got many academics there. We actually think we think that we need more private sector even in those dialogues, and we're raising up our hands so that we could actually be part of some of that collaboration going forward. So we want to be plugged in, and going forward, we do hope that invitation remains open. So I think that's it from me. Evidence is the issues of access and reimbursement, is the issue of information dissemination, and obviously collaboration with government and civil society to enable access to many of the members out there. Thank you, Lungi.
Thank you very much, Samu. And I do think Dr. Pillay mentioned to your last point on collaboration, mentioned that they will have to be defined processes of private and public partnerships, and there are many layers of that public-private partnership as relates to the vaccine. And I do think that we need to intentionally build those bridges. And so, Dr. Pillay, do expect a few calls on suggestions on how those bridges can be built and how the private sector can come to the fore in assisting in the rollout of this vaccine. Just one last final question to all of you. If you can switch on your videos. Just starting with you, Greg, the one question from the Q&A that I think you could answer for us is that it would seem that there have been concerns that have been raised about the science and the dosing of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Do you have any thoughts about this, any comments on this at all?
So I can say, because my name's mentioned as an independent assessor for the AstraZeneca trial, and I have full confidence in the team that did the work. There are no issues at all about the trial.
No concerns.
Yeah,
wonderful.
And it's all in the public domain.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. And just one question, sorry, lastly about these trials. So, considering some of the cost elements that you've mentioned, and some of the supply, issues about supply and cold chain, which have been one of the things that have been spoken the most about, which of the vaccines would you say we need to keep our eyes most on, based on the information that's available? If you were to triangulate all the pieces of information, which vaccine do you think would be the one we would prefer the most in South Africa?
Are you talking about the ones that are not Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca?
Any of it.
Look,
you know,
I mean, if you're talking about applicability, then AstraZeneca of the three so far is probably the most applicable to our situation. Of the ones coming up, hopefully with results in the next month, we're talking about Novavax and Janssen's J&J vaccines. And the J&J one, I think may be exciting because it's potentially a single dose.
Single dose, yeah.
You know.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Prof. Hussey.
No problem, thanks.
Please don't leave though. Two questions to you. Maybe both you and Greg could weigh in on this one. The first question is about, so everyone seems to understand, and they're very happy with understanding that healthcare workers would be priority one. But it seems to be hazy after that. So who would be 2 and 3? Is it those with comorbidities? And if so, which comorbidities? Is it the elderly? You know, we spoke a lot about the elderly at the time of the first wave, and even now the second wave. The elderly were a big population group that we spoke about, even from a death perspective. So would they be next? And then you mentioned the overcrowded settings, and the concern about that is that that's such a big population of people in South Africa. So is that not too big a cohort? So your thoughts about number 2 and number 3 after healthcare workers, both Anban and Greg.
So I think from my perspective, I think the point that Tian made is very important, is that we need to use the evidence in deciding who's next on the priority list. I mean, we could go with our own subjectivity about it, but I don't think that would be fair, and the public would ask lots of questions about why is this a group and not another. So the question would be, after our healthcare workers, which group would be at greatest risk of mortality if they contracted COVID? And whichever group that is, that's a group that should get it first. And I think the data will probably speak for itself, but I think the elderly come up very clearly within that spectrum. Thereafter, it's clearly people that have comorbidities. And when I say comorbidities, I mean 2 or 3. You know, they have obesity. Together with that, they have diabetes, hypertension, etc. So I think the data we have in South Africa from the DATCOP system is probably the richest, because it has a public and private information, and very nicely brings together comorbidities and looks at the mortality and morbidity. And I think that would probably drive our decision making, and should, because then we can account very clearly as to the basis on which we selected particular groups or didn't select other groups.
Very good point. Greg, do you want to add anything to that? You did show us Andrew Bull's study.
Yeah, no, I think Anban's answered it very well. I mean, I think the big issue really is can we make a decision that we are comfortable with, and on an evidence-informed decision-making basis, and that's it really.
Very, very good. And I do think that the study that you highlighted is a very telling study, and in fact it's very consistent with what we see in our data about the comorbidities, and in fact, as we should know, that the multiple comorbidities is your highest risk area. The last question for you, Anban, is do you think that there's potential for you to iron out some of the concerns that you had on the COVAX agreement? Is there still room to iron some of those things out, even though you have made a decision?
It's very difficult to iron them out in the agreement. However, COVAX has indicated that the concerns we have won't play out in the application. So to give you an example, they argue that, look, if there's a vaccine that you can't use because of local circumstances, we will certainly consider that in allocating you a different vaccine.
I see.
But in the agreement, it doesn't look like, if lawyers are reading agreements, and they don't see that brotherhood there, right? So they just see, if you don't like the vaccine, it's tough luck, just take it. So we're hoping that these things don't play themselves out. They're obviously risks, but every other country has signed up to this COVAX agreement. I mean, if I had to go back in time and redo the COVAX agreement, that's something I would really want to do with COVAX. I've said this to them directly as well, that I don't think that agreement is fair on many countries, because if you look at the financial declarations around the agreement, it ignores the PFMA requirements that South Africa and many other countries have, because we're basically not doing a tender, no competitive process, just handing over money to COVAX, and they're going to decide in their own processes with very little transparency about which vaccine they're going to select, right? And but the countries would have to pay and account to their citizens why that vaccine was selected. So there are huge issues there, and so I would have done it differently. But we are where we are, and we're against time. So rather than having to debate them, we decided to move on.
All right. Thank you so much, Anban. We really appreciate your inputs. Also, before you sign out, can you indicate whether or not you'd be comfortable with the presentation being shared or not?
Yeah, that's fine.
I think we're losing Lungi a little bit.
Thank you so much. Tian, your last question is probably the most... Oh, your last question, Tian, is whether or not we should force people to vaccinate. What's your thoughts on that?
I think if we are going to say that we exist to live, vote, pay tax in a functioning democracy, I think the principle of choice has to be at the center. Compelling people to take any action never turns out well. At the root of it, individuals must have choice. So we would say that absolutely not to mandatory vaccination. But just to add on to what Anban raised around COVAX, so us as a group of civil society have actually commissioned an audit into COVAX. I think it's important to remember that COVAX is an unelected body. We have no ways and means of holding COVAX to account. But while it's important and it's urgent, and like Anban said, we have to get it done, and COVAX is basically what we have to deal with, that should proceed. But it should proceed knowing that civil society will do what we do best, and that is to practice oversight. So keep your eyes peeled for the launch of our audit report on COVAX at the end of January.
Thank you so much to everybody who joined the panel. I thank you profusely to the panelists who joined us and gave us such insightful information. I'm certain that everybody who joined the webinar are leaving richer in terms of the information that they have and their understanding of how all the factors relating to the vaccine itself, as well as to its rollout, how they interplay. It is not a very simple process, and there are many balls to juggle, but it certainly is encouraging to know that many of those are actively being taken into account, and we're really appreciative to the openness of the conversation from all of you. Well, we will share the presentation as soon as we have them, and we will make sure that everybody who has joined into the call receives it, as well as the recording. Thank you so much for your time. Please do continue to ask us any questions that we may have the ability to answer even post this webinar. We'll be able to do that for you, and be on the lookout for many updates from us at Afrocentric as we gather them both in the media and in some of your inboxes directly. Have a great evening and enjoy your day of reconciliation tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.